Skeptics argue that the Gospels were written far after the events they report in distant lands like Rome, Egypt, Turkey, and Greece. They're not a product of eyewitness testimony, but a collection of stories passed on for decades. The original story of Jesus got mixed up over time, like a long game of telephone. But is this really what happened? Pretend for a minute that you're assigned to write a biography about a roving advertising salesman named Hayden from Iowa who lived in the 1960s. You aren't allowed to visit Iowa, and you can't use any maps, Google, or even visit the library. Your only sources would be a handful of people from California who never actually met Hayden, but only heard stories about his travels. Unless you already have some local knowledge of Iowa, you'd probably struggle to name a lot of towns outside of, say, Des Moines or Cedar Rapids. You certainly wouldn't be able to give precise locations, distances, elevations, bodies of water, and landscapes without some serious help. I mean, I've lived in Iowa for the past 20 years, but I didn't grow up here. I know I would definitely struggle. So if the Gospels were written by people in distant lands, we'd expect them to make a lot of geographical goofs. Instead, we see the exact opposite. The Gospel writers don't just know first century Palestinian geography when compared to other sources. They actually are valuable sources themselves. Just take a look at the list of towns that they mention. Sure, they get easy things right like the capital, Jerusalem, but they also get all kinds of small villages correct, like Bethany or Bethphage, Cana, and Sychar. This isn't an easy thing to do. In total, the Gospel writers mention 26 different towns. The apocryphal Gospels don't light a candle to the four Gospels by comparison. For example, the apocryphal Gospel of Philip only names Nazareth, Jerusalem, and Jordan. The Gospel of Thomas only mentions Judea. And the Gospel writers don't only list cities, they also reference regions, bodies of water, and specific local places. The question naturally arises, how would they get this kind of local knowledge? It would either have to be personal experience, reading, or hearing. But this kind of local knowledge would be unparalleled if they learned it all just from reading. As New Testament scholar Peter J. Williams remarks, no known sources hold together the particular set of information they have. But if they got this information from hearing, it wouldn't just be from listening to stories with spiritual messages, but stories with very specific details. So the most likely explanation is that the Gospel authors got their information from first-hand experience or very detailed hearing. All four Gospel writers also mention geographical places at a very high rate. Just take a look. Matthew 4.9, Mark 5.4, Luke 5.1, John 4.9, so about the same between the four Gospels. Now, it can be granted that reliable and unreliable reporting could have the same kind of frequencies we see here, but it seems really silly to argue that they were trying to present these details with a certain frequency just to make the Gospels look more believable. To me at least, it seems like this is better explained through an unconscious effort of reporting. Now let's look at the bodies of water. It's interesting to note the various mentions of the Sea of Galilee. For a body of water that's only 13 miles long, it's weird that a Greek or Roman author would call it the sea. The Mediterranean is a real sea to them, not a body of water that's less than 1/300th size of Lake Michigan. But we'd totally expect Galilean fishermen, who spent their entire careers fishing on this lake, to call it the sea. But oddly enough, the one non-Jewish author doesn't. Luke, who grew up around the Mediterranean, wasn't all that impressed with their sea. It's also noteworthy that John, a fisherman, mentions more bodies of water than any other gospel author, but the details get even more minute than this. In John chapter 2, we read, "The trip from Cana to Capernaum is going down." Similarly, in John 4, it says that Jesus came again to Cana, and a royal official who had a sick son in Capernaum came to him. He implores Jesus to come down and heal his son. The elevation of Cana is around 700 feet above sea level. Capernaum is around negative 700 feet. And then in John 5, it says that Jesus went up to Jerusalem, presumably from Cana. Jerusalem has an elevation of 2,575 feet. The Gospels also know that Bethsaida and Capernaum are located by the Sea of Galilee. Matthew and Mark know that you can travel from the Sea of Galilee directly into the hill country. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are also aware there is Judean desert near the Jordan. The authors also also knew the location of a tiny village called Chorazin. In Luke chapter 10, Jesus rebukes Chorazin along with Bethsaida and Capernaum for their faithlessness. To show why this is impressive, let's go back to New Testament scholar Peter Williams. He writes, "The little-known village in Chorazin is in fact on the road to Bethsaida and is just a couple miles north of Capernaum. As far as we know, there is not a single literary source that could have provided this information to a gospel author." So when we look at the big picture, the evangelists repeatedly display an extraordinary amount of geographical knowledge. This doesn't show that the gospels aren't fictional per se, but this information is very surprising if we think the gospel writers were writing from somewhere very distant in the Roman Empire. They obviously had some high-quality information. This also proves that the writers were familiar with the land themselves, or at least their sources were. This information is also consistent with what we'd expect if the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Gospels aren't what we'd expect at all from people who made up stories from far, far away, as the critics allege.